Thank you for joining today. I'm going to take you through the rise and fall of KOKO Networks, how Kenya's clean cooking giant collapsed. And if you have not subscribed, kindly do so. Imagine walking into a small shop in one of Kenya's crowded informal settlement. You're not looking for a smartphone. You're not sending money either. You are simply trying to cook. Instead of buying charcoal, carrying a heavy gas cylinder, or searching for paraffin, you walk to a small KOKO fuel dispenser, tap your account, and refill a small canister with biothermal fuel. It is fast, it's clean, and for millions of Kenyan families, it became a part of everyday's life. But in early 2026, something shocking happened. The machines stopped working. The fuel stopped flowing. Employees were told not to report to work. And the company, once celebrated as one of Africa's most innovative clean energy startups, suddenly began shutting down its doors. This is the story of KOKO Networks, a company that promised to change the way Africa cooks, a company that attracted major international investors, a company that reached more than 1 million Kenyans households, and a company whose business model was ultimately caught between carbon market, government approvals, international finance, and the realities of doing business in Kenya. This is the rise and fall of KOKO Networks. To understand the story better, we have to go back to the beginning. KOKO Network was built around a simple but enormous problem. Millions of African households depended on charcoal and firewood for cooking. For many low-income families, charcoal is not a lifestyle choice. It is simply what they can afford. But charcoal comes with a heavy cost. It produces smoke. It contributes to deforestation. And inside small houses, the smoke can create serious health risks. Liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, is cleaner, but for many low-income households, the cost of buying a full cylinder and the equipment needed to use it can be a major barrier. KOKO Network believed it had found another solution: biothermal. The idea was simple. Instead of asking poor families to buy large quantities of fuel at once, create a network where they can buy small amounts of cleaner cooking fuel whenever they needed it. And that is where KOKO's technology came in. The company created a network of smart fuel ATMs. These machines were installed in shops and retail outlets, bringing fuel closer to the people. A customer could go to a nearby KOKO point, refill a container, and return home. For a family living from one day to the next, this was important. They did not necessarily need to find money for an entire gas cylinder. They could buy only what they needed. KOKO was not just selling fuel, it was trying to build an entirely new energy ecosystem. The company combined fuel dispensers, especially designed cooking stoves, reusable canisters, and digital technology. The vision was bold. Clean cooking should not be a luxury for the rich. It should be available to ordinary families, and Kenya became the center of this experiment. KOKO's network began expanding rapidly. Its dispensers started appearing in neighborhoods across Nairobi and other parts of the country. The blue KOKO flames became familiar in places where charcoal smoke had dominated kitchens for generations. The company was just attracting customers. It was attracting attention from the global investment world. KOKO Networks was backed by major international investors and climate-focused institutions. Its business model was presented as something bigger than an ordinary fuel company. It was a climate solution. Every household that moved away from charcoal could potentially reduce emissions, and those reductions could be connected to the growing global carbon market. This is where the story becomes much complicated. Because KOKO's fuel was subsidized, the company wanted customers to access cleaner cooking at prices they could afford. But cleaner fuel has costs. The fuel must be sourced. It must be transported. The machines must be installed and maintained. The company must pay workers, and the entire distribution network must operate. So, how could KOKO sell fuel cheaply and still survive? The theory was straightforward. If millions of thousands moved away from charcoal and used the cleaner cooking system, the transition could generate measurable emissions reductions. Those reductions could then be converted into carbon credits. The credits could be sold to buyers in international markets. The revenue from those credits could help finance the subsidies. In other words, the customer could pay less for the fuel because another part of the business was expected to generate revenue. On paper, this was an extremely powerful model. It connected the daily cooking habits of ordinary Kenyan families to the global fight against climate change. A family in Kibera could cook dinner. A company somewhere else in the world could buy carbon credits. Imagine that. And the financial system would help pay for the transition. This was the promise. And for a while, it appeared to work. KOKO expanded. The company invested heavily in infrastructure. It built a network of fuel ATMs. It developed its own cooking technology. It entered partnerships. It expanded its ambitions beyond Kenya. And the number of households using the service grew rapidly. By 2023, the company said it had reached more than 1 million households. Later figures placed the number of affected customers at around 1.3 to 1.5 million households, depending on the source and the point in time being measured. For many customers, KOKO was not just another startup. It had become part of their daily routine. People had invested in the stoves. Retailers had become fuel distribution points. Agents had built a business around the system, and families had changed the way they cooked. But while the company was growing on the ground, a much bigger question was developing behind the scenes. Could KOKO's carbon credit business continue to support the entire operation? That question became increasingly important because the company was spending enormous amounts of money building its network and subsidizing customers. Reports indicate that KOKO had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in building its clean cooking network, while the business model depended heavily on carbon credits revenue to help support low consumers' prices. And then came the regulatory problem. Carbon markets are not simply a matter of producing a product and finding a buyer. International carbon credits transactions depend on rules, verification, and government approvals. Kenya had also introduced the new rules governing carbon markets. One important issue was the letter of authorization, commonly known as the LOA. This authorization was connected to the ability to transfer or sell certain carbon credits internationally. For KOKO, this was not a minor administrative document. It was connected to the financial engine of the business. Without the necessary approvals, the company faced the difficulty accessing the international markets that were supposed to help finance its operations. At the same time, there were also challenges surrounding the importation and sourcing of biothermal fuel. KOKO had previously relied on imported fuel, but after an import permit issue in 2023, the company had to depend more heavily on the local supply. That supply was reportedly more difficult and expensive to secure consistently. The result was a dangerous combination. The company needed affordable fuel. The customers needed low prices. The business needed carbon credit revenue. And the regulatory environment was changing. By late 2025 and early 2026, the pressure had reached a critical point. KOKO needed government authorization connected to the carbon credits that were central to its financial model. But the approval were not obtained. The company urged that without those approvals, the business could no longer operate sustainably. The Kenyan government, however, had its own concerns about carbon markets, carbon credit integrity, and the wider regulatory framework. The dispute was not simply about one company. It was part of a much bigger debate. Who should benefit from Africa's carbon resources? How should carbon credits be regulated? Who should benefit from Africa's carbon resources? Who should the carbon credits be regulated? How can Kenya attract climate investment while protecting national interests? And can a company build a business model that depends heavily on a market controlled by international rules and government approvals? For KOKO Networks, these questions, they were no longer theoretical. They were becoming a matter of survival. Then, at the end of January 2026, the shock came. KOKO announced that it was stopping its operations in Kenya. The company entered a wind-down process and moved towards administration. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Around 700 employees were reported to have been affected. And more than 1 million households suddenly found themselves without the fuel system they had come to depend on. For customers, the collapse was not an abstract financial story. It was personal. A family that had moved away from charcoal suddenly had to search for another fuel source. A shopkeeper who had been earning from KOKO fuel dispenser lost a part of their business. A customer who had bought a KOKO stove was left wondering what would happen next. In places like Kibera, the impact was particularly visible. Fuel dispensers that had once served customers every day were left idle. Some customers returned to charcoal. Others had to look for more expensive alternatives. And the question was painful. What happened when a clean energy system disappears overnight? KOKO's collapse also revealed the vulnerability of the business model itself. The company had created a system that appeared to solve several problems at once: cleaner cooking, affordable fuel, climate financing, technology, employment. But all of these parts were connected. And when one critical part of the system failed, the entire structure was placed under pressure. This is the central lesson of the KOKO story. A company can have brilliant technology. It can have millions of customers. It can attract powerful investors. It can solve a real problem and still collapse if its financial model depends too heavily on something outside its control. For KOKO, that vulnerability was carbon credit financing and regulatory approvals connected to it. The company's supporters argued that it had delivered real benefits. Families had access to cleaner cooking. Charcoal consumption could be reduced. The company had built infrastructure and created employment. But critics of carbon credit models have raised a broader concern. What happens when essential service for poor households depend on a volatile international financial market? What happens when the revenue that keeps prices affordable suddenly disappears? And what happens to their customers when investors, regulators, and companies cannot agree? The KOKO collapse has therefore become much bigger than the story of one company. It is a warning for the entire clean energy sector. Africa needs cleaner cooking. Millions of households still depend on polluting fuels. But the transition must be financially sustainable. It must be affordable. It must be properly regulated. And perhaps, most importantly, the people using the technology can be left exposed when the business model fails. By February 1st, 2026, PwC had taken over as administrator, with the joint administrators appointed to manage the company's affairs. Later in 2026, the company's assets were put up for sale, including technology, intellectual property, fuel distribution infrastructure, and other parts of the KOKO ecosystem. That means the KOKO story may not be completely over. The brand may disappear, the company may be sold, its technology may be acquired, another investor may attempt to revive parts of the business, or the system may become a case study in what happens when ambitious African climate tech company runs out of financial oxygen. But regardless of what happens next, one thing is clear: KOKO Network was not a small experiment. It was one of the boldest attempts to change the way millions of African families cook. It took a basic problem, the need to prepare food every day, and connected it to technology, climate finance, and global investment. At its peak, KOKO represented a powerful idea that clean energy could be affordable, that technology could reach low-income communities, that Africa could create innovative solutions to African problems. But its fall exposed an equal powerful reality. Good ideas need more than technology. They need stable financing. They need clear regulations. They need reliable supply chains. And they need a business model that can survive when one source of income disappears. So, was KOKO Network destroyed by poor management? Was it a victim of regulatory uncertainty? Was the carbon credit model too risky? Or was it simply a company whose ambitions grew faster than the system supporting them? The final answer may take years to fully emerge. But the story of KOKO Networks leaves Kenya with an important question. If a company can help millions of families move away from charcoal, should the system be allowed to collapse when its financial model comes under pressure? And if the answer is no, who should be responsible for keeping such essential services alive? Because the rise and fall of KOKO Networks is not just a story about a company that failed. It is a story about Kenya's energy future. It is a story about the promises of green investment. It is a story about carbon markets. And above all, it is a story about what happens when the future of ordinary families become connected to the financial system that most of them have never heard of. KOKO Networks promised to change the way Kenya cooks. For a time, it appeared to be doing exactly that. But when the money behind the model stopped flowing, the machines stopped too. And the company that once represented the future of clean cooking became one of Kenya's most dramatic startup collapse stories. This is the rise and fall of KOKO Networks. And perhaps the biggest lesson is this: a company can change the world with a great idea, but to survive, that idea must also survive reality. Thank you for today. And remember, if you have not subscribed to this channel, kindly please subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so that when you post a documentary like this, you become the first person to watch. Thank you for your support.